nomadic lifestyle. And I talked a little bit last night about the consequences of the invention of agriculture. The first consequence was surplus, something the human race had never dealt with before, because in the hunter-gatherer situation, once you've gathered enough, you stop working. Agriculture is a process where you sort of push a button, and lo and behold, here comes abundance. More abundance than you know what to do with. So you have a new problem. The problem is not getting enough food. Now the problem is preserving it and defending it. And both of these problems can be solved by ceasing to wander and beginning to build walls. And so this is what was done. The most advanced structure, human structure on this planet 10,000 years ago was the grain tower at Jericho. And it was specifically built for agricultural surplus, and it was built with walls around it to defend itself. Around 10 to 11,000 years ago, in the archaeological record, all across Europe, the ancient Middle East, and North Africa, we get the appearance of what's called the Tanged Point Techno-Complex. What this means is, in older strata than the strata of the Tanged Point Techno-Complex, when you find an arrowhead, you find one arrowhead. It was lost by some Paleolithic hunter in the pursuit of game. 12,000 years ago, what you suddenly find are huge concentrations of arrowheads in one place. This means these are not hunting sites. These are sites where somebody laid siege to somebody else's scene in order to grab their women and their food supply and their animals. In other words, warfare is the natural consequence of agriculture. And the cultural pattern that we see in the ancient Middle East is a pattern of walled cities, kingship, suppression of women, slavery, and bronze-tipped warfare. All the progenitors of our own curiously twisted cultural adaptation are set in place there.
So, this is a point which may be only important to me, but what you're saying is that really once the first woman or group of women, whoever it was, made this temporal connection and saw that, we ship the seeds out or whatever happens, 12 months later there's more food, we don't have to wander around so much. Once that happened, the die was cast, for McDonald's and the military-industrial complex, in effect. And that once some tribe or bunch of people have a lot more than they could use, and it's there, then it becomes tempting and in a way adaptive for other people to say, why wander around out here, screw around, let's just go kill these people and take their shit. Right. And that's a lot easier.
Right.
Now, and also what you're saying is that nobody noticed that this was fucked up at the time.
Well, it happened over a very long period. And the other thing that I'm saying is... go ahead.
No, to me that seems to be an important point. In other words, there was a major maladaptive cultural development that happened over a lot of time. At the time, nobody else was noticing that this was bad.
And it was driven by weather, see. It was driven by the fact that things were just getting drier and people were trying to find a solution to the drying problem.
Nobody thought to say, if we don't store up all this stuff, these other people won't be trying to kill us.
Right. Nobody could conceive of how to return to the nomadic style. And of course, once people started agriculture, then in some cases to be a nomad meant you would have to move through these people's areas and their fields, and then they would be waiting for you with rocks and clubs because they don't want your herds tromping through their fields. But the real key factor, which straight anthropology doesn't acknowledge, is that the slow fading of the use of psilocybin is what permitted all of this, because the the boundary dissolving quality of psilocybin is the most important quality, and it changed us from monkeys into these shamanic, feminine honoring, goddess worshipping nomadic people. And then when it began to fade, the reassertion of these older primate patterns, the reestablishment of male dominance over women and so forth, there was nothing to stop it. So I really see psilocybin as a kind of inoculation against the primate nature, that before the first moment of human history, the human being had been perfected, and by that I mean human beings means people able to express affection and care for others, people filled with a sense of group cooperation and group destiny, and so forth and so on, and that really we should see psilocybin as an inoculation against the formation of ego. Ego is the psychic component, which is the fly in the soup. And the ego, it's a maladaptive attitude which changing conditions made into an adaptive attitude. It went from being a form of pathology to being the only game in town as the nature of the situation changed. Ego is dissolved by hallucinogens, and so the hallucinogens kept this egoless society in a kind of stasis for a long, long time. But when the presence of the mushroom weakened and disappeared, then these older primate patterns flowed in and dominated the situation. In the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, you essentially get this message, except it's told from a dominator point of view. I mean, a careful reading of Genesis will show this is the story of history's first drug bust. And it's a woman who's in trouble. What she does is she eats a forbidden fruit. It's forbidden to her by a male, by Yahweh. And she also corrupts her roommate. And and if you read in the older recensions, like the Q document it's very clear. It says that their eyes were opened. The issue is not that this is a poisonous plant. At one point in the story, Yahweh, walking in the garden, mumbles to himself, if they eat of the fruit of the tree of life, they will become as we are. The issue was one of a striving for equality on the part of the human beings and a suppression of that desire for equality by this gardener, this keeper of the garden, whoever this guy was. And so then in the story, they're tossed out of Eden. And it says an angel was set at the eastern gate of Eden with a flaming sword so that they could never make their way back in to Eden. To my mind, this is simply the African sun drying up this partnership paradise. About 10,000 BC, people begin to settle in the Nile Valley. Before that, people didn't live in the Nile Valley. It was an unhealthy place. It was a boggy, malarial lowland, and people lived in what we call the Sahara Desert, but which was then the Saharan grassland. It was only when the grassland turned to desert that people moved out of the grassland and then settled near the river, and those are the proto-dynastic civilizations of the Egyptian archaeological record. In the Tesseli Plateau in southern Algeria, there are rock paintings 7,000 to 15,000 years old that show shamans with mushrooms sprouting out of their bodies and being held, hands full of mushrooms. They're reproduced in my book here. So I think part of what is happening in the in the 20th century is we're making our way back into deep time, and we're discovering our own childhood, and what we're discovering is a pattern of abuse and trauma. The reason human beings are so given to addiction and so restlessly uncomfortable with being is because we, every single one of us, are the victims of a dysfunctional relationship and a trauma that occurred in the childhood of our species. We were meant to be the mushroom-using monkey. We were meant to be to have a balanced relationship between the masculine and the feminine. We were meant to be the caretakers of the earth. But when the connection to the mushroom was broken, then we turned to building grain silos, forging spears, building walled cities, establishing the mythology of kingship, slave classes, so forth, and so on. And this is why the rediscovery of these things in the 20th century is so important, because we have now been at this male dominator linear culture for about 7,000 or 8,000 years, depending on how you want to measure it, and it has pushed us to the brink of extinction. Not only us, but the entire planet is now threatened with upheaval, mass extinction, toxification, because of our maladaptation to being. We don't know how to behave. Yeah, Paul.
I just want to question another longer-term scenario here. There's some evidence that humans have consistently wiped out. For example, we may have wiped out the Neanderthals, who may have been, despite what has been said in the past, peaceful, evolved species. And then earlier on, we may have wiped out, as more monkeys, wiped out some of the other pre-humans. And then what about the great mammoths and other animals which seem to get wiped out just at the time when humans were developing?
Religion coexisted with nature on this planet in a less than fatal arrangement. You know, from the moment that agriculture was invented, the die was cast. Because first of all, agriculture is a strategy for dumping a huge database, the database of the hunter-gatherer, and replacing it with a database that is important for only 5 or 6 species of plant. You then give up nomadism, which begins to concentrate your impact on the land into one place. You then plant these crops, and you have such success producing food that now moving anywhere is unthinkable. Plus, the big project after the fall harvest festival is now we have to build a wall to keep the starving people from stealing our surplus. So immediately there's us successful people and those people who weren't successful and who have different cultural values and who didn't produce a food surplus. So, we've decided we're going to sharpen sticks and kill all of them. So then you have warfare, thicker walls, retreat into cities, standing armies, defensive territory, class structure emerge, the notion of wealth as an abstraction, because wealth in a Aboriginal society is a sharpened stone, not your portfolio with your investments neatly listed, you see. So this is, just a pass over these themes. I know a lot of people came hundreds of miles and drove a long way today, and I tend to whip you with this stuff. But the idea is that the psychedelics are more than the best fun there is, which they are, more than a tool for exploring your own psyche and straightening out your own kinks, which they are. They are, in fact, the key to understanding the pathology that culture has become and the way out. I mean, there has to be a way out, and it really is this archaic revival. I mean, and if you're resisting it, think of it this way. If we don't organize the archaic revival, it will be handed to us on a platter in the form of failed agriculture because the ozone hole is screwed up, infrastructures falling apart, financial systems falling apart, the rise of fundamentalist religion. In other words, we are going to have a return to a previous historical model, and it can either be managed humanely through an honoring of the feminine, an honoring of the earth, a return to the techniques of ecstasy that characterized the high Paleolithic shamanism, or it can be handed to us in the form of shortages, famines, disease, internecine warfare, nuclear proliferation, toxic dumping, so forth and so on. But one way or another, this whole edifice put in place by the Renaissance and jacked up to high speed by the European Enlightenment and delivered into this hellish climax by mathematical analysis and the rise of global technology. I mean, remember, each of us has never seen these changes within a lifetime, and yet within the past 200 years, the world has gotten tremendously more pathological, tremendously more ill. The size of cities, the power to extract natural resources, to mine Siberia and the mountains of Chile and the interior of the Amazon and Borneo, and these unimaginable technological infrastructures have been put in place to sustain a dying patient. And that's what we have here. We're on respirators. We're getting intravenous feeding. They are monitoring everything because it's not healthy. It can only be sustained through the most extraordinary and heroic means. We're taking bone marrow from the children of the future in order to keep a corpse alive. And people don't find their voice. They don't seem to know how to call a halt. You know, I mean, I listen to the politicos who aspire to leadership, and, you know, they have the same problem with the vision thing as the maximum leader of the present moment. So these are the things that we'll talk about this weekend, and you must steer me or I will harangue. And it's not a pretty sight, I must tell you.